The old wooden porch creaked under her boots as she stepped outside, just like it had every morning for the past 8 years. The sun was barely peeking over the mountains, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. This was her favorite time of day, when the world felt peaceful and quiet. But lately, even this beautiful moment couldn't shake away the heavy feeling in her chest. She pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the barn. Her border collie, Rex, trotted beside her with his tail wagging. At least someone was happy around here. Rex was getting old now, his black and white fur turning gray around his muzzle. But he still followed her everywhere. He was probably the only living thing that truly understood her these days. The ranch stretched out before them, 200 acres of rolling hills and grassland that had been in her family for 3 generations. Once upon a time, this place had been something special. Her grandfather used to tell stories about the old days, when dozens of cattle roamed these fields and cowboys would gather around the campfire at night, sharing jokes and planning the next day's work. Those days felt like a distant dream now. She opened the barn door and breathed in the familiar smell of hay and leather. Her small herd of cattle was already stirring, ready for their morning feed. There were only 12 head left now, down from the 100 her father used to keep. Every year, she had to sell a few more just to pay the bills and keep the lights on. The math wasn't hard to figure out. At this rate, she'd be completely out of cattle within 2 years. As she filled the water troughs, her mind wandered back to better times. She remembered being a little girl, running through these same fields with her father, learning how to rope and ride. Back then, the ranch felt alive. There were always people around ranch hands, neighbors stopping by for coffee, friends coming over for barbecues on summer evenings. The house had been full of laughter and conversation. Now, the silence was so complete it almost hurt. She could go days without hearing another human voice, except for the radio that crackled with static from the nearest town 40 miles away. Sometimes she would drive into town just to hear the cashier at the grocery store say, "Have a nice day." It was pathetic, really, but those few words of human contact meant more to her than she cared to admit. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, an elderly rancher who kept to himself. They would wave if they passed each other on the road. But that was about it. Everyone around here minded their own business, which used to be fine with her. But somewhere along the way, minding her own business had turned into complete isolation. She finished feeding the cattle and walked back toward the house, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The house looked tired, just like everything else around here. The white paint was peeling, and a few shingles had blown off the roof during the last storm. She kept meaning to fix these things, but every repair cost money she didn't have. Besides, what was the point? Nobody ever came to visit anyway. Inside, she made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where her father used to read the newspaper every morning. The chair across from her had been empty for 8 years now, ever since the heart attack took him. She was only 26 then, too young to inherit such a big responsibility, but too stubborn to sell the place and move to the city like everyone said she should. Her college friends had all moved on with their lives. They lived in apartments in Denver and Phoenix, working office jobs, going out for drinks after work, dating, getting married, having kids. Sometimes they would call, but the conversations always felt forced. What was she supposed to say? That she spent her day fixing fences and worrying about money? That her most exciting social interaction was chatting with the mailman once a week? She used to be different. In high school, she had been popular, always surrounded by friends. She played volleyball, went to parties, had a boyfriend who promised they would get married after college. But life had other plans. When her father got sick, she came back to help run the ranch. The boyfriend couldn't handle the isolation and left after 6 months. One by one, her friends stopped calling. The silence crept in slowly, like water filling up a sinking ship. The hardest part wasn't being alone. She had gotten used to that. The hardest part was feeling like she was letting down everyone who came before her. Her grandfather had built this ranch from nothing, working 16-hour days to turn wild land into something productive. Her father had kept it going through good times and bad, always finding a way to make ends meet. And here she was, watching it all slip away, one sold cow at a time. She finished her coffee and looked out the window at the fields. The grass was turning brown as winter approached. Soon, she would need to bring the cattle closer to the barn and start feeding them hay that cost more every year, while the price of cattle stayed the same. The cycle was broken, and she didn't know how to fix it. Rex wandered over and put his head on her lap, looking up at her with those wise old eyes. "I know, boy," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "We're both getting tired of this, aren't we?" Sometimes she thought about selling everything and starting over somewhere else. Maybe getting a job in town or renting a small apartment, living like a normal person. But every time she seriously considered it, something held her back. This place was more than just land and buildings. It was her family's legacy, her identity, her home. Walking away felt like giving up on everything her grandfather and father had worked for. The phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. It was probably someone trying to sell her something, or maybe the bank calling about the overdue payment on the tractor loan. She let it ring. Whatever it was could wait. She had cattle to check on and fences to mend, just like every other day. As she pulled on her work gloves and headed back outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. She couldn't keep living like this, trapped between a past she couldn't recreate and a future she couldn't imagine. But change seemed impossible when every day was exactly the same as the one before. The morning sun was fully up now, warming her face as she walked toward the far pasture. Rex bounded ahead, chasing a rabbit that quickly disappeared into the brush. For a moment, watching him run with such joy, she almost smiled. Almost. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by the familiar weight of another long, quiet day stretching out before her. She had no idea that in just a few weeks, everything would change. That a mysterious visitor would arrive at her ranch, carrying with him not just the promise of treasure, but something even more valuable, a reason to hope again. The October morning air was crisp and clean, with that special feeling that comes just before winter settles in for good. She was carrying buckets of water to the cattle when Rex suddenly stopped in his tracks. His ears perked up, and his whole body went rigid like he was pointing at something invisible. She had never seen him act this way before. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, setting down the buckets and following his gaze toward the eastern edge of her property. At first, she didn't see anything unusual, just the rolling hills covered in brown grass, the same view she had looked at thousands of times before. But then something moved near the old fence line, something dark and large. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was a horse, but not just any horse. This was the most beautiful animal she had ever laid eyes on, a massive black stallion that looked like it had stepped out of a painting. Even from a distance, she could see the power in its muscles, the grace in the way it moved. But something was wrong. The horse was moving strangely, like it was struggling with something heavy. She grabbed her father's old binoculars from the porch and focused them on the mysterious visitor. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. The stallion was dragging something behind it, something metallic that caught the morning sunlight. A thick rope was wrapped around the horse's chest and shoulders, and whatever it was pulling had carved deep grooves in the dirt behind it. "Well, I'll be," she muttered, lowering the binoculars. In 8 years of living alone on this ranch, she had never seen anything like this. The horse was clearly exhausted. Even from far away, she could see that its coat was covered in dried sweat and dirt. Its head hung low, but it kept moving with the kind of determination that comes from having traveled a very long way. This wasn't some neighbor's horse that had wandered off. This animal had a mission. She climbed over the fence and started walking toward the stallion, moving slowly so she wouldn't spook it. Rex stayed close beside her, his tail wagging nervously. As they got closer, the details became clearer and more puzzling. The thing the horse was dragging looked like some kind of military case, old and battered but still in one piece. It was about the size of a large suitcase, made of dark metal with reinforced corners and what looked like government markings on the side. The stallion noticed her approach and stopped moving. For a moment, they just stared at each other across 30 feet of grassland. The horse's eyes were intelligent and tired, like an old soldier who had finally reached his destination. There was something almost human about the way it looked at her, as if it was trying to communicate something important. Easy there, big fellow, she said softly, taking another step forward. What have you got there? To her amazement, the horse didn't run away. Instead, it took a few steps toward her, dragging the heavy case through the grass. This was not normal horse behavior. Most wild horses would bolt at the first sight of a human, especially when they didn't know. But this stallion seemed to want her to see what it had brought. She approached carefully, talking in a gentle voice the whole time. That's a good boy. You've come a long way, haven't you? Look at you, all covered in dust and sweat. Where did you come from? When she finally got close enough to touch the horse, she could see just how exhausted it really was. Its flanks were heaving, and white foam had dried around its mouth. This animal had been traveling hard for a long time, possibly days. But, despite its obvious fatigue, there was something proud and noble about the way it held itself, like it had accomplished something important. The rope harness was crude but effective, made from what looked like old climbing rope and leather straps. Someone had rigged the setup specifically for hauling heavy objects, and they had done it well. The horse's coat was rubbed raw in a few places where the rope had chafed, but nothing looked seriously injured. She turned her attention to the mysterious case. It was definitely military, with faded stenciling on the sides that she couldn't quite make out. The metal was scarred and dented, like it had been through some rough times, but the latches and hinges still looked solid. Most interesting of all, there was a combination lock holding it shut, an old-fashioned one with 4 spinning dials. What do you suppose is in here? She asked the horse, as if it might actually answer her. The stallion just stood there, breathing heavily and watching her examine his cargo. Every few seconds, it would look back in the direction it had come from, then back at her, like it was making sure she understood that this case was meant for her. She tried to lift the case, but it was incredibly heavy. Whatever was inside, there was a lot of it. The metal handles were worn smooth from years of use, and when she shook it gently, she could hear things shifting around inside. Not the sound of broken pieces, but the solid weight of objects that had been carefully packed. Well, boy, I can't open this out here, she told the horse. But first, let's get you some water and food. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. She expected the horse to resist when she reached for the rope harness, but again, it surprised her. The stallion stood perfectly still while she carefully untied the knots and freed it from its burden. As soon as the weight was gone, the horse seemed to relax, rolling its shoulders and shaking its massive head. Leading the horse back to the barn was like walking with an old friend. It followed willingly, stopping when she stopped, matching her pace perfectly. Rex trotted alongside, no longer nervous, but curious about their unusual visitor. At the barn, she filled a large trough with fresh water and watched the horse drink deeply. She had never seen an animal so thirsty. It must have emptied half the trough before finally lifting its head. Then she brought out some of her best hay and a bucket of oats. The horse ate gratefully, but not greedily, like it had good manners. Despite its obvious hunger, while the stallion ate, she went back to drag the heavy case into the barn. It took all her strength to move it just a few feet at a time. By the time she got it inside, she was breathing as hard as the horse had been. She spent the rest of the day trying to figure out where the horse had come from. She called the sheriff's office, but they had no reports of missing horses. She posted notices at the feed store and the diner in town, but nobody recognized her description of the black stallion. She even drove to the neighboring ranches, but nobody was missing a horse. As the sun began to set, she realized that both the horse and the mysterious case were going to be staying with her, at least for now. She had no idea what either of them meant, but for the first time in years, she felt something that had been missing from her life for far too long. She felt curious. She felt excited. She felt like something important was about to happen. For 3 weeks, that metal case sat in her barn like a giant puzzle box, taunting her every time she walked past it. She had tried everything she could think of to open it. She tried her birthday, her father's birthday, even her grandfather's birthday on the combination lock, She tried common combinations like 1234 and 0000. She tried the year the ranch was founded and the year her family had first bought the land. Nothing worked. The black stallion, which she had started calling Midnight because of his dark coat, seemed to watch her attempts with interest. He had settled into life on the ranch like he belonged there, grazing peacefully with her cattle during the day and returning to the barn each evening. It was almost like he was waiting for something, keeping guard over the mysterious case he had brought to her. Every night, she would sit on her porch and wonder about the case's origins. The military markings were faded, but she could make out enough to know it was old, probably from decades ago. She had looked up similar cases online during her trips to town, where she could get internet access at the library. They seemed to be the kind used by the army during World War II, or maybe even earlier. The breakthrough came on a cold Thursday morning when she decided she couldn't wait any longer. She loaded the case into her pickup truck, along with Midnight, in the horse trailer, and drove to town. Old Jake, the blacksmith, had been working metal for over 40 years. If anyone could help her open the case without destroying whatever was inside, it would be him. Jake's workshop smelled like coal smoke and hot metal. He was a thin man with calloused hands and eyes that had seen everything at least twice. When she explained her situation, he listened quietly, occasionally nodding his head. Military case, you say? Jake rubbed his stubbled chin. Haven't seen one of these in years. My daddy worked on a few during his time. Let me take a look. He examined the lock carefully, turning it over in his weathered hands. This lock's been damaged, he said finally. See these scratches here? Someone tried to force it open, but gave up. The mechanism's probably jammed inside. Can you open it without breaking whatever's inside? She asked, her heart pounding with anticipation. Jake smiled. Child, I've been opening stubborn locks since before you were born. Give me an hour. She waited outside, pacing nervously while Jake worked. The sound of metal tools clinking together drifted from the workshop. Midnight stood quietly in the trailer, as if he knew something important was happening. Finally, Jake called her back inside. The case sat open on his workbench, revealing contents that made her gasp. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth, were bundles of old letters tied with ribbon, black and white photographs, and a collection of jewelry that sparkled even in the dim light of the workshop. Well, I'll be. Jake whistled softly. Looks like someone's family treasures. Her hands shook as she picked up the first bundle of letters. The handwriting was elegant and old-fashioned, written in faded brown ink. The return address made her heart skip a beat. The letters were addressed to someone with her family's last name, someone she had never heard of before. Jake, I need to take this home and look through it properly, she said, carefully repacking everything. How much do I owe you? The old blacksmith waved his hand. No charge, child. Finding family history is worth more than money. But you come back and tell me what you discover, you hear? Back at the ranch, she spread everything out on her kitchen table. The letters were written in a mix of English and Spanish, from a woman named Elena to someone she called, my dearest Thomas. As she read through them, a love story began to unfold that took her breath away. Elena wrote about her life in Mexico, where her father owned vast lands and raised cattle. She wrote about the revolution that was tearing her country apart, about families fleeing north to escape the violence. Most importantly, she wrote about her love for Thomas, who she had met during one of his cattle-buying trips to Mexico. The photographs showed a beautiful young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing the same jewelry that now lay scattered across the table. In some pictures, she was standing next to a tall man who looked remarkably like the old photos of her great-grandfather that hung in the hallway. Could Thomas be her great-grandfather? She had never heard much about him, just that he had died young and left behind the ranch that would eventually pass to her grandfather. But these letters painted a picture of a man deeply in love with a woman from Mexico, a woman who was trapped by the chaos of revolution. The later letters grew more desperate. Elena wrote about her family's plan to flee Mexico, about treasures they were hiding before they left. She wrote about a promise Thomas had made to keep something safe for her, something valuable that her family could use to start a new life in America. The final letter was dated 1918, and it was heartbreaking. Elena wrote that she was sick with the flu that was sweeping through the refugee camps. She was dying, she knew it, but she wanted Thomas to know about the treasure her family had buried on his land before they continued their journey north. She had drawn a rough map on the back of the letter, marking the location with Spanish words and landmarks. "If anything happens to me," the letter read, "please keep this safe for any of our family who might need it someday. The revolution took everything else from us, but this treasure could help someone start over when the world is peaceful again." She sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the story unfolding before her. Elena had died of the flu pandemic, never able to return for her family's treasure. Thomas, her great-grandfather, had kept the secret until his own death just a few years later. The case had somehow survived in hiding for over a century, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. But how had Midnight found it? And why had he brought it to her now, when she needed hope more than ever? She studied the hand-drawn map on the back of Elena's final letter. The landmarks were described in Spanish, but she could make out references to an old oak tree and a creek that bent toward the rising sun. Some of the features might still exist on her property, even after all these years. As the sun set outside her kitchen window, she realized that Elena's treasure might still be buried somewhere on her land, hidden for over a century, waiting for someone from the family to claim it. The thought was almost too incredible to believe, but the evidence was right there in front of her. She looked out at Midnight, grazing peacefully in the pasture. Somehow, this mysterious horse had known exactly where to find the case and exactly who to bring it to. It was as if Elena's spirit had guided him across the countryside, determined to finally complete a promise made over 100 years ago. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of real excitement. Tomorrow, she would start looking for Elena's treasure. The next morning, she woke up before dawn with Elena's hand-drawn map burned into her memory. She had studied it so many times the night before that she could see every line and marking when she closed her eyes. The excitement was almost too much to handle. For the first time in years, she had something to look forward to, something that could change everything. She made coffee and toast, but her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the cup. Rex sensed her excitement and kept pacing around the kitchen, his tail wagging furiously. Even he knew something big was about to happen. The first challenge was understanding Elena's Spanish descriptions. Her high school Spanish was rusty, but she managed to figure out the basic landmarks. El robo partido por el rayo meant, the oak split by lightning. Donde el royo se inclina, hacia el sol naciente, translated to where the creek bends toward the rising sun. These were the two main reference points on the 100-year-old map. She knew there was an old creek bed on the eastern side of her property, though it had been dry for years due to drought. As for the lightning-split oak, she would have to search for that. Oak trees could live for centuries, so there was a chance it might still be standing. Her neighbor, Old Bill from the next ranch over, had mentioned having a metal detector that he used to hunt for old coins and artifacts. She had never talked to him much, but this seemed like a good time to be neighborly. She drove over to his place, her heart pounding the whole way. Bill was a gruff man in his 70s who had lived alone since his wife passed away 5 years ago. He looked surprised to see her at his door, probably because she had never visited before. When she explained that she was looking for something buried on her property, his eyes lit up with interest. "Family treasure, you say?" Bill scratched his gray beard. "Well, I'll be damned. I've been hoping someone would ask to borrow my detector. Haven't used it in months. You can take it as long as you need. Just promise to tell me if you find anything good." The metal detector was heavier than she expected, with a long handle and a round disc at the bottom that would beep when it found metal underground. Bill spent an hour showing her how to use it, explaining the different sounds it made for different types of metal. "Silver and gold make a nice clean beep," he explained. "Iron and steel make a harsh buzzing sound. And remember, you might have to dig through a lot of old nails and bottle caps before you find anything worthwhile." Back at her ranch, she started her search near the dry creek bed on the eastern edge of her property. The autumn air was crisp and cool, perfect for walking around outdoors. She had packed a backpack with water, snacks, a shovel, and a small camping chair in case she needed to rest. Midnight seemed to understand what she was doing. Instead of staying with the other cattle, he followed her around the property, sometimes walking ahead of her toward specific areas. It was almost like he was trying to guide her, which seemed impossible but felt strangely real. The metal detector was harder to use than Bill had made it look. For the first 2 hours, it beeped constantly, sending her digging for rusty old horseshoes, bent nails, and pieces of barbed wire that had been buried for decades. Her back started aching from all the bending and digging, but she refused to give up. Around noon, she took a break and studied Elena's map again. The Spanish writing mentioned that the treasure was buried, "Sis pies bajo la tierra, cerca del agua que corre hacia la luz de la mañana," 6 feet underground near the water that runs toward the morning light. That had to mean the old creek bed. She moved her search closer to where the creek used to flow, following the natural depression in the land where water had carved its path decades ago. Midnight walked beside her, occasionally stopping to paw at the ground with his hoof. Every time he did this, she would run the metal detector over that spot, but usually found nothing. Late in the afternoon, just when she was starting to think this whole treasure hunt was a crazy dream, the metal detector made a sound she hadn't heard before. It was a clear, strong beep that kept repeating every time she moved the disc over the same spot. This wasn't the harsh buzz of old iron or the weak signal of a bottle cap. This sounded like what Bill had described as the good stuff. Her heart started racing as she marked the spot with a small flag and began digging. The ground was hard and packed, but she dug carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was down there. 1 foot down, nothing. 2 feet down, still nothing. At 3 feet, her shovel hit something that wasn't dirt or rock. She dropped to her knees and started digging with her hands, brushing away soil like an archaeologist uncovering ancient artifacts. What she found made her gasp out loud. It was the corner of another metal container, this one much larger than the case Midnight had brought her. By the time she had fully uncovered it, the sun was setting and her clothes were covered in dirt. The container was huge, about the size of a small trunk, and incredibly heavy. There was no way she could lift it out of the hole by herself. She would need help, and probably some kind of pulley system. That evening, she called Jake the blacksmith and explained her situation. Jake was so excited by her discovery that he offered to bring his truck and some equipment the next morning to help her lift the container out of the ground. "You realize this could be the find of a lifetime," Jake said over the phone. "Buried treasure from the Mexican Revolution. I've heard stories about wealthy families hiding their valuables before fleeing north, but I never thought I'd meet someone who actually found one of these caches." She barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities. What if the container was full of gold coins? What if it contained precious gems or valuable artwork? What if it was enough money to save the ranch and restore it to its former glory? The next morning, Jake arrived with his pickup truck, some heavy-duty rope, and a manual winch system. He also brought his son Tommy, a strong young man who worked construction and knew about moving heavy objects safely. It took all 3 of them and most of the morning to get the container out of the ground without damaging it. When they finally had it sitting on the grass beside the hole, she could see that it was even older than the first case. The metal was green with age, and there were Spanish words engraved on the lid that had been worn smooth by time. The container had a simpler locking mechanism than the first case, just a heavy latch that had rusted shut over the decades. Jake carefully worked it loose with oil and patience, and finally, the lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and canvas, was a collection that took her breath away. Gold coins from Mexico and Spain, some dating back to the 1800s. Silver jewelry set with emeralds and rubies. Small gold bars with Spanish markings. Ornate religious items made of precious metals. And at the bottom, a leather pouch full of loose gems that sparkled like captured starlight. Jake let out a low whistle. "Girl, you just found yourself a fortune." 3 days later, she was sitting in the office of an antique appraiser in Denver, watching a woman with white hair and thick glasses examine each piece of Elena's treasure with careful precision. The appraiser's name was Mrs. Henderson, and She had been dealing with rare artifacts for over 30 years. Her hands moved delicately over each gold coin, each piece of jewelry, making notes in a leather-bound notebook. "This is extraordinary," Mrs. Henderson said softly, holding up a gold necklace set with emeralds. "These stones are genuine Colombian emeralds, probably worth more now than when they were first set. And these coins," she picked up a Spanish gold piece. "Some of these date back to the 1700s. They're museum quality." The final appraisal made her dizzy. $800,000. More money than she had ever imagined having in her entire lifetime. Enough to save the ranch, fix everything that was broken, buy new cattle, and still have plenty left over for whatever the future might bring. But the most surprising thing happened on her drive back home. As she stopped for gas in a small town, a reporter from the local newspaper recognized her from photos Jake had shared on social media. Before she knew it, she was telling Elena's story to a journalist who seemed as fascinated by the romance and mystery as she was. "This is an incredible human interest story," the reporter said, scribbling notes furiously. "A century-old love story, a mysterious horse, buried treasure, and a ranch saved from bankruptcy. Would you mind if we ran this in tomorrow's paper?" She agreed, thinking it would just be a small local story that maybe a few hundred people would read. She had no idea what was coming next. The story went viral overnight. First, the Denver newspapers picked it up. Then the regional television stations started calling. Within a week, she had reporters camping at the end of her driveway, and her phone was ringing constantly with interview requests from across the country. A documentary crew from the History Channel arrived on a Tuesday morning, led by a friendly producer who wanted to film the entire story. For the first time in 8 years, her ranch was full of people: camera operators, sound technicians, researchers, and historians, all working together to tell Elena's story properly. At first, all the attention felt overwhelming. She had gotten so used to silence and solitude that having a dozen people on her property made her nervous. But slowly, something wonderful started happening. She began to enjoy the company. The crew members were interesting people with stories of their own. They would sit around her kitchen table in the evenings, sharing meals and talking about everything from history to dreams for the future. The documentary producer, a woman named Carol who had traveled the world making films, became especially interested in the horse rescue idea that had been growing in her mind. "You know," Carol said one evening as they watched midnight grazing in the pasture, "that horse didn't just bring you treasure, he brought you a new purpose." That conversation changed everything. With the treasure money as her foundation, she started planning something that would honor both Elena's memory and Midnight's mysterious journey. She would create a sanctuary for abandoned and rescued horses, a place where animals that had nowhere else to go could find safety and care. The first horse arrived just 2 months later, a skinny mare that had been neglected by owners who couldn't afford to feed her properly. Then came an old gelding whose owner had died, leaving him with no one to care for him. Within 6 months, she had 12 horses living on her ranch, each one with its own story of hardship and rescue. But the horses weren't the only ones being rescued. The sanctuary brought people into her life in ways she had never expected. Volunteers came to help with feeding and grooming. Veterinarians offered their services at reduced rates. Local businesses donated supplies and equipment. Families brought their children to learn about horses and responsibility. For the first time since her father's death, her ranch was alive with purpose and community. The silence that had nearly crushed her spirit was replaced by the sounds of horses nickering, people laughing, and children asking endless questions about the animals they were meeting. One of the most meaningful moments came when she received a letter from Mexico. A genealogy researcher had seen the documentary and traced Elena's family tree. Elena had cousins still living in a small town south of the border, descendants who had wondered for generations what had happened to their family's lost treasure. She decided to travel to Mexico to meet them, bringing some of Elena's jewelry and photographs to return to her family. The reunion was emotional beyond words. Elena's great-niece, a woman about her own age, wept when she saw the photographs of her ancestor. They spent hours looking through Elena's letters, with the family translating the parts that had been written in Spanish. Elena would be so happy to know her treasure helped someone, the great niece said through tears. She always believed that family took care of family, even across generations and borders. Back home, the sanctuary continued to grow. She hired 2 full-time employees to help with the daily care of the horses, both of them young people who loved animals and needed steady work. The ranch that had once felt like a prison of isolation became a center of community activity. Local schools started bringing classes for educational visits. The 4-H club held meetings in her renovated barn. Families came for weekend visits, and some even started volunteering regularly, becoming like extended family to her. But the most important relationship was still with Midnight. The mysterious stallion had never shown any interest in leaving, settling into life at the sanctuary like he had always belonged there. He seemed to understand that his mission was complete, but he had chosen to stay and help with the new chapter of the story. Every morning, she would walk out to the pasture and find Midnight waiting for her, just like Rex used to do. The old dog had passed away peacefully the previous spring, but Midnight had somehow filled that role of constant companion and friend. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the volunteers had gone home, she would sit on her porch and watch the horses grazing in the fading light. Midnight would often come to the fence, as if checking on her, making sure she was okay. "Thank you," she would whisper to him, still not fully understanding how he had known to bring Elena's case to her at exactly the moment when she needed hope most. "Thank you for bringing me back to life." The ranch was thriving now, but more than that, she was thriving. The treasure had saved her financially, but Midnight had saved her in ways that money never could. He had brought her purpose, community, and the reminder that sometimes the most important journeys begin when a stranger shows up at your door carrying exactly what you need. As she looked out at her sanctuary full of rescued horses and thought about all the people who now considered her ranch a second home, she realized that Elena's treasure had been more than gold and jewels. The real treasure had been the connections, the purpose, and the hope that came from opening her heart to the world again.